The smell hit me before the words did. I was standing in my kitchen in Clapham, steam curling off a cup of Yorkshire tea, the radiator ticking against the cold outside, when my phone buzzed against the counter. My cousin Farah's name lit up the screen. We hadn't spoken in 4 months. Not since the funeral. I almost didn't pick up. Sana. Kai's ho beta. Her voice was too bright, too rehearsed. The way people sound when they're about to tell you something they don't want to actually discuss. I'm fine, Farah. What's going on? There was a pause, the kind of pause where you can hear someone deciding how much to say. Then she said it, casually, like she was mentioning the weather. Bah, good news. The house finally sold. Uncle Rizwan closed everything last week. Alhamdulillah, it's done. I remember exactly what I was holding when she said that. A chipped white mug, the one Grandma had given me the last time I visited her in Birmingham. The one with a faded rose pattern that had survived 3 house moves and 2 continents. My fingers went cold around the handle. Sold, I repeated. Not a question. Just the word sitting in my mouth like a stone. Hun, finally. You know how it's been sitting empty. Uncle said it was becoming a headache. Council tax, maintenance, all of that. Better to just close the chapter, you know. Close the chapter. As if Grandma's house was a paragraph in someone else's story. As if I hadn't spent every eat of my childhood in that kitchen, hadn't held Grandma's hand in that same living room during her last conscious week, hadn't promised her, actually promised her, with her fingers wrapped weakly around mine, that the house would stay in the family, that I would make sure of it. Who bought it? Asked, keeping my voice level. This is a skill you learn in my line of work. You don't let your voice tell people what your mind is doing. Some private buyer. Anonymous, apparently, went through a solicitor and a limited company. Uncle Rizwan said it doesn't matter who, cash offer, no chain, quick completion. Best possible outcome, really. I stood very still. Because I knew exactly who the anonymous buyer was. It was me. You need to understand something about me before this story goes any further, because if you don't, none of what happens next will make sense. And trust me, what happens next is the part people ask me about most. My name is Sana Malik. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 9 years I've worked as a property transactions paralegal for a mid-sized conveyancing firm in London. The kind of job that sounds boring at dinner parties but means I understand exactly how ownership moves from one set of hands to another. I know what a chain of title looks like when it's clean, and I know what it looks like when someone's cut corners. I know the difference between a proper grant of probate and a family just assuming they can sell a dead woman's house because nobody stopped them. I've been sitting on that knowledge for 3 months. Quietly, patiently, while my family congratulated themselves on outmaneuvering me. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and if there's one thing 9 years in this profession has taught me, it's that timing is everything. So let me take you back to where this actually started. Not with a phone call, but with a woman named Zainab Malik, the only person in my family who ever looked at me and saw someone worth listening to. That's where I need to start. Because to understand why I did what I did, quietly, legally, and without a single raised voice, you need to understand exactly what they took from me first. What they didn't know was that I'd already stopped playing by their rules months ago. Let me tell you who I was before any of this happened. Not who I became, who I was. I grew up in Birmingham, in a terraced house 3 streets away from the one this whole story revolves around. My parents worked constantly. My father drove for a logistics company, 12-hour shifts, and my mother did alterations for a dry cleaner's on the high street, hunched over a sewing machine until her eyes gave out for the day. Money was always tight, but nobody ever said that out loud. In families like mine, you don't talk about what's missing. You just quietly go without and smile at dinner. The one place I never felt like I was going without was my grandmother's house. Her name was Zainab Malik, and she lived in a modest 3-bedroom semi-detached house on Aldridge Road, the kind with a small front garden she was fiercely proud of, roses she pruned herself well into her 70s. That house wasn't grand. It wasn't worth a fortune. But it was the one constant in a childhood that otherwise felt like it was being lived in someone else's shadow, because I was the middle child of 3, and my cousins outnumbered me at every family gathering, and somehow I always ended up being the one nobody quite remembered to ask about. Grandma remembered. Grandma always remembered. Every Friday after school, I walked to her house instead of going straight home. She'd already have the kettle on. She'd sit me down at her kitchen table, the same table that's still there today, scratched at one corner where I used to dig my nails in nervously during exam season, and she'd ask me real questions. Not how was school, the way adults ask children when they don't actually want an answer. She asked me what I was reading, what I was scared of, what I wanted to be. Told her when I was 11 that I wanted to understand how houses worked, not architecture but the paperwork, the ownership, the legal skeleton underneath the bricks. I don't know why. Maybe because her house felt like the one solid thing in my world, and I wanted to understand what made something solid stay that way. She laughed and said, "Property brings out the worst in families, Beta. Remember that. Whatever you do, remember that." I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. I studied law for 2 years before switching into a conveyancing and property law pathway. Partly practical, partly because something about that conversation with Grandma had rooted itself in me. By 25, I was working as a residential conveyancing paralegal in Birmingham. By 29, I'd moved to London for a better position at a firm that specialized in probate property sales. Houses sold after someone dies, estates untangled, chains of title traced back through decades of family history until ownership is airtight and clean. You need to sit with that detail for a second because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I didn't just work in property. I worked specifically in the property of the dead. I understood, better than almost anyone in my family, exactly what happens legally when someone passes away and leaves a house behind. I understood grants of probate. I understood what happens when there's a will versus when there isn't. I understood how easily families convince themselves that speed matters more than doing things properly. While I was building that expertise in London, Grandma was getting older in Birmingham, and I made the 2-hour train journey back almost every second weekend. Not because anyone asked me to, because nobody else did and somebody needed to. I was the one who sat with her at her cardiology appointments after her first minor heart scare at 78. I was the one who set up her prescription delivery service so she wouldn't have to walk to the chemist in winter. I was the one who found her a private carer 3 days a week when my mother and aunts all had reasons they couldn't take a bigger role. Reasons that always seemed to evaporate the moment there was a family photo being taken. Everyone gathered around Grandma smiling for the camera, playing devoted. And it was during one of those Saturday visits, 18 months before she passed, sitting at that same scratched kitchen table with 2 cups of chai going cold between us, that Grandma told me something I never repeated to another living soul. Not then. Not for a long time after. "This house," she said, her hand resting flat on the table like she was taking an oath, "should go to you." I remember laughing, a little uncomfortable, the way you do when someone says something too big for the room. "Nanny, you have 3 children and 6 grandchildren. You can't just." "I can do what I want," she said, and there was steel in her voice I rarely heard. "I've watched this family for 60 years. I know exactly who shows up and who only shows up for photographs. You think I don't notice who visits and who calls only when they need something signed?" She held my hand across that table, her grip surprisingly firm for a woman her age. "You're the only one who never asked me for anything," she said. "That's why it should be you." I told her we'd talk about it properly, that she should speak to a solicitor, formalize whatever she wanted through a proper will so there'd be no confusion later. She waved me off the way she always did when she thought I was being overly cautious. "Beta, you worry about paperwork too much. This is family. Family understands." I should have pushed harder. That's the one regret sitting underneath this entire story. I knew professionally exactly how dangerous that kind of casual verbal promise is once someone passes away without proper documentation. I'd seen it destroy other families in cases that crossed my desk. I knew better than almost anyone what happens when good intentions aren't put into writing. But she was my grandmother. And some part of me, the granddaughter part, not the paralegal part, didn't want to sit across from a dying woman's kitchen table and start talking like a lawyer. That decision would cost me almost everything. And it would also, eventually, become the very thing that let me win it all back. Because what none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that 18 months later, when Grandma passed away quietly in her sleep on a Tuesday in March, I wasn't just her favorite granddaughter anymore. I was about to become the only person in that family who actually understood what was legally happening to her house. And they were about to make a mistake big enough that I wouldn't have to raise my voice once to correct it. Have you ever spent years explaining away the way people treat you, because admitting the truth would mean admitting something painful about your own family? That was me for almost a decade. I want to walk you through this properly because the events that came later, the meeting I wasn't invited to, the discovery, the quiet purchase, none of it makes sense unless you understand exactly how deep this pattern ran. This wasn't one bad moment. This wasn't a single betrayal that came out of nowhere. This was a decade of small, deliberate exclusions, each one so minor on its own that I talked myself out of noticing it, until they added up into something impossible to ignore. Let me give you the first example because it's the one that still sits strangely in my chest even now. I was 26. My cousin Farah, the same Farah who called me about the house sale, was getting married, a big Pakistani wedding with 3 separate functions. The Mendi, the Barat, the Walima. The kind of wedding where the whole extended family gets involved months in advance, where aunts start comparing whose daughter's outfit cost more, where everyone has a role. Everyone except me. I found out about the Mendi date through a WhatsApp group photo. Not an invitation, a photo posted after the fact of everyone dancing, my Aunt Roxana front and center in a bright pink lehenga, my other cousins lined up in coordinated outfits they'd clearly planned together for weeks. I wasn't in a single photo. I hadn't been told the date. When I called my mother, confused, hurt, trying to keep my voice steady, she said something I still remember word for word. "Beta, we just assumed you were busy with work in London. You know how it is. We just assumed." As if my absence from 3 days of family celebration was a scheduling inevitability, rather than a deliberate omission. As if nobody could be bothered to send one text message asking if I was free. I let it go. I told myself it was a miscommunication, that these things happen in big families, that I shouldn't read too much into it. That's the first lie I told myself. It wouldn't be the last. The second example came 2 years later, and this one involved money, which, in my experience working in property law, is almost always where the real truth about a family finally surfaces. People can hide their feelings behind polite smiles for years. They cannot hide what they do with money. My uncle Rizwan, Grandma's eldest son, the one who eventually orchestrated the house sale, had, for as long as I could remember, been the designated responsible one in the family. This was a title he'd given himself, not one he'd earned, but nobody ever challenged him on it because he was the eldest son, and in a lot of South Asian families, that title comes with an unspoken authority that nobody wants the discomfort of questioning. When Grandma's youngest grandson, my cousin Bilal, wanted to start a small business, a car detailing service, nothing extravagant, Uncle Rizwan quietly arranged an interest-free loan of £8,000 from Grandma's savings account, which he had access to because he was listed as a joint signatory for convenience, a phrase that should set off alarm bells in anyone who understands elder financial protection, but which nobody in my family questioned because, again, family understands. I only found out about this loan by accident, during a visit to Grandma's when I noticed a bank statement on her kitchen counter and, out of professional habit more than nosiness, glanced at the transaction history. £8,000, transferred out in a single lump sum. No record of repayment terms, no paperwork, nothing. When I gently asked Grandma about it, she waved her hand dismissively. Rizwan is helping Bilal get on his feet. It's fine, Beta. Family helps family. I asked carefully whether there was anything in writing, a loan agreement, even an informal one, just to protect everyone. "You worry too much about paperwork," she said again, the same phrase she'd use 18 months later when I tried to get her to formalize the house. "This is not a courtroom. This is family." I let that go too. I told myself it was Grandma's money, her choice. Not my business to police how her own children and grandchildren managed things between themselves. But you need to notice something here because I certainly didn't at the time. Bilal never repaid that loan. Not a single pound of it. And 3 years later, when Grandma's estate finally became a subject of family discussion, that £8,000 gift was never once mentioned as an advance against his inheritance. It simply vanished into the family's collective memory. The way inconvenient debts always do when the person who benefits from forgetting is the same person controlling the narrative. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. I want to pause here and say something directly to you because I know exactly what it feels like to sit where you're sitting right now, listening to this and feeling something tighten in your own chest, because maybe this isn't just my story. Maybe you've lived some version of this yourself. Maybe you're the one in your family who always shows up, always remembers birthdays, always drives 3 hours on a Sunday to help a parent with something nobody else wanted to deal with, and somehow you're still the one who gets forgotten when it matters. I'm not telling you this story so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this so you recognize the pattern before it costs you what it almost cost me. Because the third example, this is the one that finally cracked something open in me, even though I still didn't act on it for another 2 years. It was Grandma's 79th birthday. My mother and my 2 aunts, Roxana and Yasmin, decided to organize a family lunch at a banquet hall in Handsworth. Nothing extravagant, but a proper sit-down event with about 40 guests, extended relatives, family friends, the whole social apparatus that these events always involve. I found out about it exactly 9 days beforehand, through a cousin's Instagram story, not through any direct communication from my mother or my aunts. When I called my mother to confirm, trying again to keep the hurt out of my voice, she told me the venue was already fully booked. 40 places, she said, all accounted for. There simply wasn't room for one more chair. Except there was. Because at the actual lunch, which I did eventually attend after insisting, after a conversation with my mother that left both of us upset, I counted the tables myself. Force of habit, maybe, or maybe some part of me needed the proof. 42 place settings. 2 empty chairs at the family table, near my Aunt Roxana, chairs that stayed empty the entire lunch, reserved apparently for family friends who never showed. There was room. There had always been room. What there wasn't, was any intention to make room for me. I sat at the far end of a side table that day, next to distant cousins I barely knew, while my closer cousins, Farah, Bilal, the others, sat at the head table with Grandma, laughing, taking photographs that would later get printed and framed and given to Grandma as a gift. I wasn't in a single one of those photographs. Not one. I remember the exact sound of that banquet hall, the clatter of serving spoons against steel trays, the wail of a Bollywood song playing too loud from a Bluetooth speaker somebody had brought, 42 voices talking over each other in a room designed for a wedding, not a birthday lunch. And underneath all of that noise, I remember the silence in my own chest, the specific quiet of finally admitting something to yourself that you've spent years refusing to say out loud. I was not part of this family's inner circle. I had never been part of it. I had simply been useful to it. Useful when Grandma needed appointments booked, useful when prescriptions needed collecting, useful when somebody needed to be trusted with the truth about a heart scare that everyone else was too busy to notice. Useful but never included. That was the moment everything shifted for me. Not into anger, not yet, but into something colder and more useful than anger. Clarity. I stopped expecting invitations after that. I stopped waiting for photographs. I kept showing up for Grandma because that relationship was never about the rest of them, but I quietly, deliberately, began paying attention in a different way. Not emotionally. Professionally. I started noticing things the way I'd been trained to notice things at work. Who had access to which accounts? Who was named where? What documents existed and which ones conveniently didn't? I told myself I was just being cautious, protecting Grandma, nothing more. What I didn't tell myself, what I couldn't yet admit, even to myself, sitting in that banquet hall with an empty photograph album where my face should have been, was that I was already building a case. Not for a courtroom. For myself, because 6 months after that birthday lunch, Grandma had the conversation with me at the kitchen table about the house. And 4 months after that, her heart condition worsened seriously enough that a temporary financial power of attorney was drawn up. And here's the detail that should make your stomach turn the way it made mine. A power of attorney that named Uncle Rizwan as sole attorney, with my mother and Aunt Yasmin listed only as replacement.
I found out about this arrangement after it was already signed. Nobody consulted me. Nobody asked whether, as someone who worked in property and estate law for a living, I might have useful input on structuring something that would directly affect an elderly woman's assets. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it's going to matter enormously later. A single sole attorney, controlling every financial decision for a woman who owned a house worth several £100,000, with almost no oversight and no second signatory required for most transactions. Grandma passed away 11 months after that document was signed. And the moment she did, the family I had spent 34 years quietly accommodating stopped pretending they needed me for anything at all. What they didn't know was that I had spent those 11 months doing exactly what I do every single day at my job, reading the fine print nobody else bothers to read, understanding exactly what that power of attorney did and didn't allow once Grandma died, and quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment they would inevitably make a mistake big enough for me to use. They didn't disappoint me. Have you ever found out about the most important decision of your life through a photo someone else posted online? That's how it started. I was at my desk in London, mid-afternoon, reviewing a chain of title for a probate sale that had nothing to do with my own family, and yet everything I was reading felt like a mirror. I checked my phone during a break and saw it, a WhatsApp status from my cousin Farah. A photo of the dining table at Aldridge Road. My mother, my two aunts, Uncle Rizwan, Farah, Bilal, all seated, teacups out, a manila folder open in the middle of the table. The caption read, "Big decisions today. Finally moving forward." Folded hands. Nobody had told me there was a meeting. I sat with that for a long moment before I called my mother. She picked up on the fourth ring, background noise behind her, dishes, a television, the particular clatter of a kitchen mid-cleanup. Beta, Kia Hua? There's a photo of everyone at Grandma's house today. Farah posted it. What decision? A pause. The kind of pause I'd learned, over years in this family, always preceded a carefully worded half-truth. Nothing big, just family discussing next steps for the house. You know, since it's been sitting empty. What next steps? Rizwan thinks it's best to list it. Market's good right now. We're just being practical. I kept my voice level, the way I always did, the way 9 years of professional composure had trained into me. And nobody thought to include me in that conversation? I have a background in exactly this. Another pause, longer this time. It's not that kind of meeting, Sana. It's a family meeting. You're always so busy in London anyway. Always so busy in London. The same sentence, almost word for word, that had excused my absence from Farah's wedding 8 years earlier. I realized, sitting there in my flat with the phone against my ear, that this wasn't carelessness. It was a script, a well-worn one, used every time convenient. I want to be part of this decision, I said. Grandma would have wanted that. We'll keep you updated, my mother said, in the tone people use when they have no intention of doing so. She hung up before I could respond. I found out 3 weeks later. Again, not directly, but through Bilal, who mentioned it almost in passing during a cousin's engagement call, that the family meeting hadn't just been about listing the house. It had been about dividing the proceeds. Uncle Rizwan, Aunt Roxana, Aunt Yasmin, and my mother had informally agreed to split whatever the sale brought in 4 equal shares, the 3 siblings, plus my mother representing what she called our branch, which apparently included my 2 brothers, but somehow not me. I asked Bilal directly. Was I mentioned at all? He hesitated. Uncle Rizwan said something like, Sanaa's already got her own life sorted in London. She doesn't need a piece of this the way the rest of us do. I remember exactly where I was standing when he said that, my kitchen, that same chipped rose pattern mug in my hand, steam long gone cold. She doesn't need a piece of this. As if the years I'd spent driving to Birmingham every other weekend, as if the appointments I'd booked, the prescriptions I'd collected, the promise Grandma had made to me at that kitchen table, could all be quietly written off because my postcode had a London prefix. That was the moment I stopped hoping this family would ever include me by choice. What they didn't know was that 3 weeks before that phone call, before Farah's photo, before any of them had even contacted an estate agent, I had already spent a weekend quietly pulling the property's title register from the land registry, out of nothing more than professional habit and a nagging unease I couldn't name. And what I found in that register didn't match anything my family believed to be true. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with knowing something important that you can't say out loud to anyone who actually matters to you. I felt it most sharply on a Wednesday evening, about 10 days after my conversation with Priya, when my mother called me, not about the house, Just an ordinary check-in call, the kind we still had occasionally, both of us pretending things between us were simpler than they were. "How's work?" she asked. "Busy," I said. "You?" "Good, good. Rizwan's dealing with some paperwork for the house, but otherwise everything's fine." Some paperwork. I wondered, sitting there with the phone against my ear, whether she had any idea how much weight those 3 words were actually carrying, whether she understood, even slightly, that some paperwork was the difference between a lawful transaction and a legal house of cards. I didn't tell her. I asked about my nephew's football instead, and she talked for 10 minutes about his upcoming match, and we said goodbye warmly the way we always did, and I sat afterward feeling like I'd just had 2 completely separate conversations layered on top of each other. The one we'd actually spoken out loud, and the one running silently underneath it, the one only I could hear. I want to walk you through the mechanics of what I actually did next because I think the specifics matter, not for drama, but because this is the part of the story where careful, unglamorous groundwork mattered more than any single dramatic confrontation.
Marcus, the solicitor I'd brought in, explained the structure clearly during our first proper call. If you buy this personally under your own name, and your family ever finds out before completion, they could simply refuse to sell to you specifically, out of spite, family politics, whatever. You need distance. A limited company as the purchasing vehicle is clean, standard practice, nobody blinks at it. Cash buyers use companies all the time for speed and privacy. Within a week, I'd incorporated a small property holding company, Aldridge Rose Properties Ltd., a name that meant something only to me, a quiet nod to the street and the roses grandma used to prune every summer. Officially, the company existed on paper the way thousands of small property investment vehicles exist across the country. Nothing unusual, nothing that would raise a single eyebrow from an estate agent processing a cash offer. Marcus also flagged something crucial, something that would end up mattering enormously later. Because there's no grant of administration yet, your solicitor, meaning me, will absolutely catch that during the title check before we let this complete. Normally I'd flag that to my client as a deal breaker. In this case you already know about it. So the real question is whether you want me to flag it publicly and blow the whole sale up, forcing them to sort out probate properly, which could take 6 months and might invite other buyers into the process. Or whether you want to use the leverage quietly. What does using it quietly look like? It looks like completion happening fast, before anyone properly checks anything, using a solicitor on their side who's either not thorough or under pressure to move quickly. It looks like you becoming the registered owner before the family even realizes what was legally required and wasn't done. And it looks like you holding afterward the absolute right to challenge or unwind that sale yourself if you ever needed to, because you'd know something about the transaction that even they don't fully understand. I sat with that for a long moment. And if their solicitor does catch it, then the sale collapses, they're forced into probate, and you simply wait quietly and make an offer once it's done properly. Either way, you're not losing anything by staying quiet right now. You're just choosing when the truth becomes useful. That conversation is the one I keep coming back to, even now, when people ask me whether I feel guilty about any of this. Because Marcus was right about something I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. I wasn't creating the danger in this situation. My family had created it entirely on their own, through carelessness, through arrogance, through the same pattern of assuming things would simply work out because they always had before. All I was doing was refusing to rescue them from a mistake they'd made without me, the same way they'd made every major decision about that house without me. What they didn't know was that their casual, hurried, badly advised rush to sell had just handed the one family member they'd excluded the exact leverage she needed to walk back into that house. Permanently, legally, and without a single one of them realizing it until it was already done. I want to go back to something I skipped over quickly, because I think it deserves more room than I gave it. The 4 days between submitting the offer and hearing it had been accepted. Because that waiting period taught me something about myself that the rest of this story only confirmed later. I didn't sleep well during those 4 days. Not from guilt, exactly. I want to be honest that I've turned that word over in my head many times since, trying to decide if it fits, and I still don't think it does, not fully. It was something closer to the specific tension of watching a plan you've built quietly, alone, without anyone to check your thinking, move forward into a world where it could still fail in a dozen ways you hadn't predicted. I kept running through Marcus's warnings in my head. What if Uncle Rizwan's solicitor was more thorough than we expected? What if someone recognized Aldridge Rose Properties' registered address, which, for practical reasons, I'd had to list as a virtual office 2 streets from my actual flat? What if Farah, who worked in local government and had a habit of being unexpectedly sharp about paperwork when it suited her, decided to look more closely at the buyer than her father had? None of those things happened. But I want you to understand that I didn't know that in advance. I was building this whole structure on the assumption that my family's carelessness would hold steady long enough for me to walk through the door they were leaving open. And there's a particular kind of vulnerability in betting everything on the worst habits of people you love. There's a scene I keep returning to from that period, because it's the moment the whole thing nearly unraveled, and I've never told anyone the details of it until now. It was the 2nd week of the 6-week completion window. I traveled up to Birmingham. Not to the house, I made sure of that, but to visit my mother, because avoiding her entirely during this period would have looked strange, and strange was the one thing I couldn't afford to look. We sat in her kitchen, and at some point, almost offhandedly, she mentioned that Uncle Rizwan had been a bit stressed about the sale. Why stressed? I asked, keeping my voice as light as I could manage. I thought it was all going smoothly. Something about paperwork being slow. He mentioned probate, I think. I don't really understand it. He said the solicitor wanted to double-check something before it all goes through. My stomach dropped. I remember exactly where I was standing, near the kettle, my back half turned to her so she wouldn't see whatever expression crossed my face in that moment. Did he say what exactly? No, just that it might take a bit longer than expected. He wasn't happy about it. You know how he gets that? I did know how he got. Impatient, dismissive of anything that slowed him down. The kind of man who'd rather push forward and deal with consequences later than pause and do something properly. Which is, I realized standing in that kitchen, exactly the trait that had made this entire plan possible in the first place. And exactly the trait that might now undo it if his solicitor pushed back hard enough to make him actually stop and sort out probate properly. I called Marcus that same evening from my car, parked outside my mother's house. Off windows fogging slightly in the cold. Their solicitors clearly noticed something, I told him. My uncle mentioned a delay, something about probate. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That could mean they're about to do this properly, which would mean our offer sits and waits for a formal grant of administration, which could take months. Or it could mean their solicitors raised a concern and your uncles decided to push through anyway, which happens more than you'd think when a seller's impatient and the buyer looks eager to close fast. What do? We do nothing, Marcus said. We don't chase them. We don't ask questions that would look suspicious coming from a cash buyer with no stated urgency of their own. We wait exactly the way any patient buyer would wait, and we let them decide which path they take. That was one of the hardest weeks of this entire process for me. Not the discovery, not even the eventual reveal, but that specific stretch of days where I genuinely didn't know whether my family was about to do the responsible thing at the last possible moment, or barrel forward regardless. Some part of me, sitting in that cold car outside my mother's house, almost hoped they would slow down. Almost hoped they'd finally, for once, do things properly. They didn't. 9 days later, Farah's message landed in the group chat. Update. Sorted the paperwork issue, moving ahead as planned. Rizwan's solicitor said it's fine to proceed. I never found out exactly what fine to proceed actually meant on their side. Whether their solicitor had genuinely satisfied themselves it was safe, or whether Uncle Rizwan had simply overridden a word of caution the way he tended to override anything inconvenient. I suspect, given everything that came later, it was the second one. But I'll never know for certain, and that uncertainty is something I've had to make peace with. I think it's worth pausing here to say something directly to you, because I know some of you listening have been in rooms like that car outside my mother's house, waiting on a decision that isn't yours to make, holding information that could change everything, and having to choose in real time whether silence is protection or complicity. Chose silence. I'm not going to pretend that was an easy or obviously right choice. I've turned it over more times than I can count. What I keep coming back to is this. I wasn't the one who created the danger. I wasn't the one who rushed a sale through without proper legal process. I wasn't the one who excluded a family member with exactly the expertise needed to prevent all of this, out of nothing more than convenience and old habit. I simply declined to rescue people from a mistake they built entirely without me, the same way they'd built every important decision about that house without me for years. That distinction has mattered to me every single day since. The final 2 weeks passed almost mechanically once that decision was made. Searches came back clean on the practical matters. No planning disputes, no unusual local authority charges, nothing that would concern an ordinary buyer. The only thing wrong with the title was the thing only I fully understood the weight of. And nobody on the selling side chose to stop and examine it properly. Completion day itself was almost anticlimactic in the way significant days in property law often are. No dramatic courtroom moment, no raised voices, just an email from Marcus at 2:47 in the afternoon confirming funds had transferred and the land registry application to update the register was being submitted. I was in a client meeting when it happened. I remember glancing at my phone under the table, seeing the notification, and feeling the strangest wave of stillness move through me. Not celebration, not yet. Just the quiet, settling knowledge that something enormous had just shifted permanently. And the people it had shifted around had absolutely no idea it had happened at all. What they didn't know, as they celebrated in a family group chat full of relief and heart emojis that same evening, was that the anonymous cash buyer, who'd made their long-awaited sale so smooth and so fast, wasn't a stranger investing in Birmingham property. It was the one person they'd spent a decade deciding didn't need a seat at their table. And she was about to walk back through that front door with a key they didn't know existed legally. Completely. And not one single person in my family had the faintest idea. That evening, back in my own kitchen in Clapham, I opened the family group chat one more time. Farah had posted a final message. Sale officially done. Money's coming through to everyone this week. So relieved to finally have this sorted. Folded hands, red heart. Underneath it, my mother had replied with 3 heart emojis. I typed a message myself for the first time in weeks. Just 3 words. That's good news. Then I closed my phone, made myself a cup of chai in that same chipped rose-patterned mug, and sat alone at my own kitchen table, 4 hours south of theirs, holding a secret that wouldn't stay one forever. What they didn't know was that the money now sitting in their accounts, being celebrated in a group chat full of heart emojis, had come from me. And what they were about to find out sooner than any of us expected would change everything about how this family understood who I actually was. I want to go back to something I skipped over quickly, because I think it deserves more room than I gave it, the 4 days between submitting the offer and hearing it had been accepted. Because that waiting period taught me something about myself that the rest of this story only confirmed later. I didn't sleep well during those 4 days. Not from guilt, exactly. I want to be honest that I've turned that word over in my head many times since, trying to decide if it fits, and I still don't think it does, not fully. It was something closer to the specific tension of watching a plan you've built quietly, alone, without anyone to check your thinking, move forward into a world where it could still fail in a dozen ways you hadn't predicted. I kept running through Marcus's warnings in my head. What if Uncle Rizwan's solicitor was more thorough than we expected? What if someone recognized Aldridge Rose Properties' registered address, which, for practical reasons, I'd had to list as a virtual office 2 streets from my actual? What if Farah, who worked in local government and had a habit of being unexpectedly sharp about paperwork when it suited her? Let me take you through the legal exchange itself in more detail, because this is the part that actually decided everything, and I don't think I explained it fully enough before. 3 weeks after Uncle Rizwan discovered my name on the company's house filing, his solicitor sent Marcus a formal letter. I read it sitting at my desk in London, Marcus having forwarded it to me the same afternoon it arrived, and I remember feeling almost detached reading it, the way you feel reading a legal document that isn't really about you even when it is. The letter alleged that the sale had been procured through deliberate concealment of a family relationship material to the transaction, and threatened an application to the court to have the sale declared void. Marcus called me within the hour. "This is bluster," he said. "There's no legal requirement to disclose family relationships in an arm's-length property transaction. Buyers use companies for privacy constantly. What he's actually upset about isn't legal. It's personal. But he doesn't have grounds, and I think somewhere in that letter he knows it. So what do we do?" We respond factually. No aggression, no gloating. We simply lay out calmly that any court application to void the sale would require the court to examine the entire chain of events, including the fact that the seller proceeded without a grant of administration, using a lapsed power of attorney, in a transaction he had no legal authority to complete in the first place. Once that's on the court record, it's not just his problem with you anymore. It becomes a problem with every other beneficiary of the estate, because he sold assets that weren't legally his to distribute. Marcus drafted that response over 2 days, and I remember reading the final version before it went out. Calm, procedural, utterly without emotion, laying out case law about defective title and voidable transactions in language so measured it almost felt gentle, even though every sentence in it was a closed door. The response that came back 10 days later was 3 lines long. No further correspondence. No court application ever filed. That was the moment, more than the phone call with my mother, more than the family group chat exploding, that I understood the matter was actually over. Not emotionally. Emotionally it would take much longer to settle. But legally, finally, completely. I want to tell you about a scene that happened almost by accident, about 2 months after that legal exchange closed, because it's the moment I think this story actually turned from conflict into something quieter and more complicated. I was up at the house on a weekday afternoon, meeting a contractor about repairing a section of guttering, when I heard a car pull up outside. I looked out the front window and saw my mother's car in the driveway. She hadn't called ahead, hadn't texted, just arrived, sitting in the driver's seat for almost a full minute before she got out. I opened the door before she reached it. I was driving past, she said, which we both knew wasn't quite true, since nothing about the route from her house to anywhere passed this street by accident. I wanted to see it. The house. I let her in. She walked through the hallway slowly, touching the wall near the kitchen door the way you touch something you're not sure is really there. And when she reached the kitchen, she stopped completely still, looking at the table. She used to sit right there, my mother said quietly, pointing at Grandma's usual chair. Every morning. Same spot, 40 years. I know, I said. I used to sit across from her. Right here. My mother sat down slowly in the chair across from where I was standing, the same seat I'd occupied hundreds of times as a child and teenager, and something about watching her sit there in my seat, in this house that used to belong to all of us and now legally belonged only to me, cracked something open in both of us at the same time. I keep thinking about what she told me, my mother said. About the house being yours. I keep wondering how many other things she told different people, that never got put together until it was too late to matter. Does it matter now? I asked. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe it just matters that I finally believe you. That you didn't do this out of spite. That you did it because it was always supposed to be yours, and none of us bothered to make that happen properly while she was alive. I sat down across from her, in Grandma's old chair for the first time since she'd died, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. I'm sorry, my mother said eventually. Not for the sale. I still don't fully understand all the legal parts of that. I'm sorry for the years before it. The wedding. The birthday lunch with the empty chairs. I remember counting them too that day. I just never said anything. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, hearing that, though not completely, some wounds don't close from a single apology however sincere. But it was a beginning, and after everything, a beginning was more than I'd expected to get. Thank you for saying that, I told her. It matters more than you probably think it does. Pattern interrupt because I want to speak to you directly again for a moment. If you've ever waited years for one honest sentence from someone in your own family, not a grand gesture, just one plain, unqualified acknowledgement of what actually happened, you already know exactly what that moment in the kitchen felt like. It doesn't erase anything. It just makes the years that came before it slightly easier to carry. There's a final piece of this story I want to share, because I think it says more about how this all resolved than any legal document ever could. Almost a year to the day after I completed the purchase, I hosted a small gathering at the house. Nothing large, nothing performative, just a quiet lunch to mark what would have been Grandma's 80th birthday. I invited my mother. I invited Farah, who came and brought her own daughter, now old enough to run around the same garden I used to play in as a child. I invited Bilal, who came awkwardly at first but relaxed once he saw the garden restored, the roses blooming again the way they had when he was young too. I didn't invite Uncle Riz, not out of continued spite, but because neither of us had reached a place yet where that would have felt honest rather than performative. Some repairs take longer than a year. I've made peace with that timeline, even if it isn't the one either of us would have chosen. I want to end this the way it actually ended for me. Quietly, not with a mic drop, not with triumph, but with something closer to peace. It's been almost 2 years now since I sat in my kitchen in Clapham and heard Farah say the words, "The house finally sold," never knowing she was talking to the buyer. 2 years since I sat with a cold cup of chai reading a title register that changed everything. 2 years since I stopped waiting for a family to make room for me, and simply made room for myself instead. I still work in property law. I still drive up to Birmingham most months, still sit at that same scratched kitchen table, still drink chai out of a chipped mug with a faded rose pattern that has somehow survived everything. 3 house moves, a death, a betrayal, and a quiet reclaiming nobody saw coming. The garden is full again. The roses come back every summer, the way they always did when Grandma was alive to prune them herself. My relationship with my mother is still being rebuilt, slowly, one honest conversation at a time. My relationship with Uncle Rizwan may never fully recover, and I've made peace with that too. Not every relationship survives the truth. Some are only held together by the things nobody says out loud, and once those things get said, you find out what was actually there underneath. Here's what I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to burn everything down to finally be seen. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop absorbing what was never fair to carry, pay quiet attention, and wait for the moment when your own patience finally becomes your advantage instead of your weakness. I didn't do any of this out of hatred. I did it because I finally understood something Grandma tried to tell me years before she died, sitting across from me at that same table. Property brings out the truth in people, whether they're ready for it or not. I was ready. It turned out, in the end, I was the only one who had been all along. If you've ever been the one who shows up quietly, who's underestimated by your own family, who's told, in 100 small ways, that you don't need a seat at the table, I hope you remember that was never the truth about you. It was only ever the truth about the people too comfortable to make room. If this story meant something to you, let me know where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment. And if you've ever had to set a boundary with your own family, even a quiet one, tell me about it below. Sometimes the smallest boundary is the one that changes everything. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Real, quiet, patient reckonings, told the way they actually happen.